Welcome back. We are talking about Ronald Reagan and his civil rights record. Yes, he actually has one. It may be dismal, but he has one. Yesterday, we discussed his beliefs prior to becoming president. Let's see if anything has changed since he's running for president now, shall we? Let's talk about his presidential campaign. So I found this on the Zen project. Okay. Uh, and it's before he even has become president. It says that Reagan was courting Southern whites. Okay. And remember, when we were discussing Nixon, I said that Reagan, like Nixon, used the Southern strategy, which was a Republican Party electoral strategy to increase political support among white voters in the South by appealing to racism against blacks. Okay. Nixon did it, Reagan did it, Trump did it. Well, most Republicans did it, so they're the most successful ones. Anyways, but in August 1980, Reagan gave a speech at the Neshoba County Fair as he campaigned for the presidency. Neshoba County is in Mississippi. The fairgrounds are just miles away from where three civil rights workers were unalived and buried in shallow graves by members of the KKK in 1964. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner were chased down, tortured, and unalived by the KKK. They were buried in an earthen dam on private property off Highway 21. Goodman was still alive. And Reagan chose to give a states' rights speech just miles from where they were unalived. Reagan appealed to the George Wallace inclined voters dreaming of a return to segregation and freedom of unfettered white supremacy in his stump speech. Now, George Wallace was the racist, segregationist governor of Alabama. He says, I believe in states' rights. I believe in people doing as much as they can for themselves at the community level and at the private level. And I believe that we've distorted the balance of our government today by giving powers that were never intended in the Constitution to that federal establishment. And if I do get the job I'm looking for, I'm going to devote myself to trying to reorder those priorities and restore to the states and local communities those functions which properly belong there. Remember, states' rights was the reason that the South said the Civil War was started. It was a state's right if they wanted to continue the practice of slavery. While campaigning, uh, especially in Georgia, Reagan mentioned Confederate President Jefferson Davis as an example of someone who used the line item veto, which Reagan supported. He supported the line item veto and felt it necessary to mention Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president. Okay. And because he's invoking all these Confederate uh, icons, the KKK endorsed Reagan and he accepted. So I have a section written out called Civil Rights because I didn't know what else to call it. This is after he has become president. And I'm just gonna share with you what I learned. It's the best way to do it. I'm just gonna share what I learned. And I do have a confession. I do have a confession that as I was reading the dissertations and the thesis and articles, my mouth fell open and it hung open from the sheer confusion that a grown man could think and say some of these things, that someone could be so disconnected from, I'm going to say reality for lack of a better word. Um, but he was, because he didn't consider himself to be a racist. If you called him a racist, he would have been offended, deeply offended. Not like a regular racist who's like, oh, no, like his feelings would have been hurt if you called him one. He did not seem to understand that his actions had a detrimental effect against Black, brown, indigenous, and other people of color. He seemed to be confused. And even when people are telling him, he seemed to be confused. His Justice Department prosecuted fewer civil rights cases per year than they had under his predecessor, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was on a mission, though, so that's an unfair comparison. Yeah, yeah. The Reagan team condemned busing for school integration and opposed affirmative action. In 1980, Reagan said the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was humiliating to the South. But in 1982, he did go ahead and sign a bill extending it for 25 years after a grassroots lobbying and legislative campaign forced him to abandon his plan to ease that law's restrictions. He was going to ease the restrictions in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 until lobbyists and a legislative campaign forced him not to. In 1988, he vetoed the Civil Rights Restoration Act, but his veto was overridden by Congress. This was especially notable as it was the first civil rights bill to be both vetoed and be overridden since President Andrew Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, followed by Congress overriding the veto and making it law. Reagan had argued that the legislation infringed on states' rights and the rights of churches and small business owners. Reagan's Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, as well as his Justice Department, prosecuted fewer civil rights cases per year than had under his predecessor, Jimmy Carter. We talked about that. So, tomorrow we'll continue our discussion on Reagan and his civil rights record while he was president.